I want to welcome you to another video drasha. This week's Torah portion is Shemot, and it is the first Torah portion in the book of Exodus. And yet, I'm going to start by continuing to talk about Joseph. The fact is that the Joseph story, which we saw occupies in the last four Torah portions in the book of Genesis, does not come to its conclusion until our portion this week. Still at the beginning of the book of Exodus, we are hearing about Joseph. And our Torah portion says that Joseph died and his brothers and all of that generation. And a new king arose who did not know Joseph. And of course, that then is the event that leads to the eventual enslavement of the Jewish people in Egypt. So the Joseph story spills over to the beginning of the book of Exodus. But another thing that I want to note, and I sometimes say I like to take sort of the bird's eye view of the events in the Torah, and that is to say to look at things from a big perspective and to ask, how does the Joseph story fit into the larger narrative of the Torah? And we have discussed various aspects of the Joseph story, but if we take this larger perspective, I think we can see the following thing. The Joseph story provides an answer for a very important question. If ultimately the book of Exodus is going to deal with the Exodus from Egypt, and the Exodus from Egypt is the most important historical event in the Torah and ultimately in all of Jewish history. And we've discussed on numerous occasions the centrality of the Exodus from Egypt in Judaism, in Jewish practice, how the Exodus from Egypt is part of so many different things that we do in Judaism. The question is, what were we doing in Egypt in the first place? I mean, I thought the Jews lived in the land of Israel. What were we doing in Egypt? And the Joseph story is, of course, the answer to that question. That's how we got down to Egypt. Now, there's a detail in the Joseph story, back at the beginning of the Joseph story, that we did not discuss at the time, but now I want to go back and take a look at it. And again, within this bird's eye view perspective, looking at the Joseph story, how it fits into the larger narrative, we can look at a very small detail at the beginning of the Joseph story and see just how significant it is. Actually, back in chapter 37 of Genesis, again, this is the first Torah portion in the narrative of Joseph. This is already after we learn of the enmity between the brothers and Joseph. This is after Jacob has already given Joseph his coat of many colors, which was really the emblem of his preference for Joseph, which is what irked the brothers so much. And then there's a very small detail, which you could even ask, why does the Torah even tell us this? And it says the brothers were out pasturing the flock, and Jacob says to Joseph, your brothers are out pasturing the flock at Shechem. Why don't you go check on them, see how the flock is doing, and see how your brothers are doing. And Joseph goes out, and the Torah then gives us this very small detail. It says that he basically bumped into a man while he was out wandering because he was lost. He couldn't find his brothers. He bumps into a man and he says to him, have you seen my brothers? And he points him in the right direction. Now, this seemingly insignificant detail that Joseph bumps into this man while he's out wandering, he can't find his brothers, we can see the tremendous significance of this. After all, if Joseph doesn't find his brothers, then ultimately they can't grab him and throw him into a pit where eventually he's picked up by the Ishmaelites and taken down to Egypt. And if he doesn't get down to Egypt, he can't become the second in in command there in Egypt, and ultimately be in a position to bring his brothers down to Egypt. So without this small event happening, if he doesn't bump into this man who points him in the right direction to get to his brothers, then the rest of the Torah doesn't unfold, and ultimately the rest of Jewish history doesn't unfold. All of Jewish history hinges on that seemingly meaningless event. And I think it points to, a very important idea, and that is that we can look at events that occur in history as simply being somehow random, meaningless, just things that just happened. Or we can see the hand of God in these events. Because ultimately, the whole course of Jewish history hinged on this one thing. Now, by the way, in the Midrash, it's made very clear that this is the hand of God working in the story, because the Midrash says that this man, and that's all the Torah calls him, is a man, but the Midrash says that it was the angel Gabriel, which makes explicit the divine involvement in this seemingly random event. And so it's another really important example of how events in history, which may seem random, which may seem to have no explanation, ultimately are part of a divine plan and are under divine providence, and it is an example of the hand of God working in Jewish history. Now, another important thing in this week's Torah portion is that this is the first time that the Jews are called a people, and it's ultimately Pharaoh who calls them. He says, Am b'nei Israel. The people of the children of Israel have become too numerous for us. And so it is important for us to note that the Jews become a people in Egypt. We came down to Egypt as simply a family, Jacob and his sons. Those are the children of Israel, the sons of Jacob. But it is in Egypt that we become Am b'nei Israel, the people of the children of Israel. And, it's interesting to note, our Torah portion says that a new king arose who did not know Joseph, and that's what led to this great change where now we were persecuted and ultimately enslaved. And we've spoken about the idea in the past that things that happen in the Torah become paradigms, they become models for events in Jewish history. And it is interesting to note that just as the Jews went to Egypt and were welcomed to Egypt, we came into Egypt, at the invitation of Pharaoh, and ultimately were persecuted there. We've seen that elsewhere in Jewish history. It's interesting to note that the history of the Jews of Poland, for instance, back in the 11th, 12th, 13th century, the Jews were welcomed into Poland. Poland was among the most tolerant places in Europe, and Jews were welcomed there because of their commercial skills. And of course, the population of Jews in Poland eventually became the largest in the world. And unfortunately, it's also the place where the largest number of Jews were murdered during the Holocaust. And so we see, again, this parallel. Things that happen in the Torah become models for events later in Jewish history. We were originally welcomed into Egypt, but were eventually enslaved there and had to escape. And that, unfortunately, has been true in other situations in Jewish history. So with those thoughts in mind, I hope that if you read this week's Torah portion, you will find these comments helpful. I want to wish everyone a good Shabbos and hope that you are staying safe.